I can still hear the sound of that door slamming behind me. It was sharp, final, the kind of sound that doesn't just end a conversation but ends a chapter of your life. I stood there for a moment on the porch, gripping the strap of my worn canvas bag, unsure if my legs were ready to carry me anywhere. The cold wrapped itself around me instantly, seeping through the holes in my coat sleeves, biting at my skin like it had been waiting for me. It was late January in Denver, the kind of winter that made the streets look like glass. Snow drifted lazily from a sky the color of wet cement. I watched my breath turn into small clouds in front of my face, each one disappearing faster than I could take the next. Behind the door, in the warmth I had just been pushed out of, my stepmother's voice had been the last thing I heard. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The calm in her tone cut sharper than any scream could. "You're old enough to figure things out on your own. This isn't your home anymore." She didn't have to remind me that my father was gone. I had lived with the echo of that truth for almost a year now, ever since the heart attack that took him in his sleep. He left the house in her name, thinking it was the safest choice. Maybe he thought it would keep us together as a family. What he couldn't have known was that her definition of family came with an expiration date. I had been working at a small hardware store until a few weeks ago, the same place I started while Dad was still alive. When the new owner decided to cut hours, mine were the first to go. Without a paycheck, the few savings I had evaporated faster than I wanted to admit. I sold some of my old college textbooks to pay for groceries. I even pawned the watch Dad had given me for high school graduation, telling myself I'd buy it back when things got better. She noticed. She always noticed. That morning, she waited for me in the living room. Her coffee mug sat on the table, steam curling up like a signal that she'd been there for a while, rehearsing what she was going to say. When I walked in, she didn't waste time. She told me I was irresponsible, that she wasn't going to let me drag this house down with my problems. And then she opened the front door. There wasn't even a suitcase for me to take. Just the bag I had kept by my bed with a change of clothes and a folder of old photographs. I'd grabbed it out of instinct, the way people in movies grab something before running from a fire. Now, standing in the snow, I realized I didn't have a plan. I didn't even have a destination. My phone was nearly dead, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd filled up on a real meal. I looked down the street where the rows of houses seemed to blur into the white haze. Somewhere out there was a bus stop, maybe a diner, maybe a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. The wind picked up, pulling my hair out from under my hat and slapping it against my cheek. My fingers were already stiff. I thought about going back, just to stand in the garage for a minute, but I knew she would lock the door behind me. She was done with me. That thought hit harder than the cold. I pulled my bag higher onto my shoulder and stepped off the porch. The snow crunched under my boots. Thin boots, more for autumn than this deep freeze. But they were all I had. The sound of them breaking the untouched layer of snow was the only noise in the stillness. The neighborhood looked asleep, but I knew behind each window was someone warm, someone fed, someone who didn't have to wonder where they'd be sleeping tonight. My father had always told me I was resilient. He used to say it when I came home from school with scraped knees or when I failed my first driving test. I repeated that word in my head now, not because I believed it, but because I needed to hear it. Resilient. As I reached the end of the block, the cold air scraped the back of my throat with every breath. My eyes watered, and I wasn't sure if it was from the wind or everything else. I didn't look back at the house. I was afraid if I did, I'd stop moving. And stopping wasn't an option. Not anymore. I kept walking because I didn't know what else to do. The snow-covered sidewalks felt endless, stretching under my boots in a blur of white and gray. My breath puffed out in front of me, curling into the air before vanishing like it had never been there at all. My hands were buried deep in my coat pockets, but the cold still found its way in, numbing my fingers. At first, I walked quickly, as if speed could outrun the weight in my chest. But after a few blocks, my pace slowed. It wasn't just the ice making me careful, it was the realization sinking in, inch by inch, that I had no destination. The idea of home had been stripped from me in a single morning, and all I had left was the street beneath my feet. Every step carried a mix of shock and a low, burning anger. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that simmers, quiet and steady. How could she stand there in my father's house and tell me I didn't belong? How could she make it sound so reasonable? Like she was doing me a favor by forcing me out into the cold? The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the block. It pulled me back to another winter, years ago, when my father and I would sit by the fireplace in the small den. He would light a fire after dinner, the room filling with that same scent, and I would curl up in the chair beside him with a blanket over my legs. "Winters are tough here," he once told me, poking at the logs with the iron poker. "But they make you appreciate warmth. Not just from the fire, from people." Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought he was just making conversation. But now, walking alone through a neighborhood where every window glowed with light I couldn't reach, the words felt heavier. Warmth wasn't just a temperature, it was belonging. It was safety. It was knowing someone wanted you there. My boots slipped on a patch of ice and I caught myself on a snowbank. The shock of cold through my glove made me pull my hand back quickly, brushing off the powder. It was a reminder that no matter how careful I was, this cold could catch me off guard at any second. I passed a grocery store I used to go to with Dad. The windows were fogged from the heat inside, shapes moving in the aisles. I stopped for a moment, watching as a mother helped her little boy into his coat near the entrance. He laughed when she pulled the hood over his head, and she bent down to zip him up completely. I had to look away. That kind of care was something I hadn't felt in a long time. The streets grew quieter as I moved farther from the main road. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but when I pulled it out, the screen stayed black. Dead battery. Not that I had anyone to call. The few friends I'd kept in touch with since high school lived hours away, and I didn't have the money for a bus ticket. Somewhere between the corner gas station and the row of shuttered shops, my legs began to ache. I thought about stopping, but stopping meant standing still, and standing still meant thinking too much. So I kept going, hoping that forward motion would keep the panic at bay. In my mind, I kept replaying the moment the door shut behind me. I wondered if my father would have fought for me if he were still alive, if he would have told her to let me stay until I got back on my feet. I liked to think he would have, but the truth was, I'd never know. The sky was beginning to dim, the clouds thickening into something darker. A few cars passed, their headlights cutting through the snowfall, but none of them slowed. I wasn't expecting them to. People don't stop for strangers in the cold. They keep moving toward wherever they're going, just like I was. Except I didn't have that final point on the map. By the time I reached the next intersection, I realized I'd been walking for hours without a plan. No money, no phone, no place to sleep. The cold had settled into my bones. I stood there for a moment, listening to the wind rush between the buildings, and felt the weight of not knowing where I'd go next, not knowing if anyone would notice if I didn't get there. By the time the streetlights flickered on, my feet felt like blocks of ice. The wind cut sharper in the dark, sliding under my coat no matter how tightly I pulled it around me. I had been walking all day, and the idea of finding somewhere, anywhere, to rest had moved from a hope to a necessity. That's when I saw it, an old bus stop shelter at the edge of a nearly empty parking lot. The glass panels were streaked with frost, and the metal bench inside looked as unforgiving as the wind. But it had a roof, and in that moment, that was enough. I stepped Inside, the crunch of snow under my boots muffled by the enclosed space. The air wasn't much warmer, but at least the wind wasn't slapping me in the face anymore. I sat down slowly, the metal pressing cold straight through my jeans. My legs ached from walking, my back sore from carrying the bag. I set it beside me, using it as a barrier on one side, and pulled my knees up to my chest. The street beyond was quiet, just the occasional car passing, its headlights spilling across the snow like brief bursts of daylight. I kept my head down whenever someone drove by, afraid they might slow down. Or worse, stare too long. I didn't want questions I couldn't answer. I dug into my bag for the knit hat I'd stuffed inside earlier and pulled it low over my ears. My gloves were already damp from brushing snow off my clothes, and every finger felt stiff. I tried to tuck my hands into the sleeves of my coat, making myself as small as possible. The cold seeped in quickly, settling into my bones like it belonged there. My breath fogged up the glass beside me, and I traced small lines in it with my finger just to keep my hands moving. It was a pointless distraction, but it kept me from focusing too much on the ache in my stomach. I hadn't eaten since a granola bar that morning, and the emptiness was a steady reminder that I didn't have a plan for tomorrow. Once or twice, someone walked by on the far side of the street. Their steps crunched on the snow, and their heads were bent against the wind. No one looked my way. I was just another shadow in the corner of their night. A gust of wind found its way into the shelter through the gap near the ground, cutting across my ankles. I curled tighter, my chin resting on my knees. The sound of the snow shifting outside was constant, a soft, steady hiss, broken only by the occasional groan of a plow moving down a distant road. I thought about Dad again, how he used to leave a small lamp on in the living room, so I'd never come home to a dark house. I could almost see it now, the warm pool of light on the carpet, the faint smell of the coffee he always made before bed. That memory hurt more than the cold. It made me feel the distance between that life and this one like a physical thing. Somewhere in the night, a siren wailed far away, then faded. My eyes burned from exhaustion, but every time I let them close, a shiver would snap me awake again. I pulled the bag onto my lap, hugging it against me as if it could block out the chill. The hours blurred together. I tried counting the cars that went by, then the number of streetlights I could see from my spot. But eventually, I stopped keeping track. The world outside the shelter seemed to move on without me, each minute stretching longer than the one before. By the time the snow stopped falling, the sky had taken on that dull pre-dawn gray. My body ached, my toes felt numb, and my jaw was sore from clenching against the cold. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. When daylight came, people would notice me, and I wasn't ready for the kind of attention that would bring. I tightened the straps on my bag, stood slowly to get blood moving through my legs again, and stepped out into the morning air. It was still cold, but different somehow, less like a threat, more like a challenge. I didn't know where I was heading, but staying still wasn't an option. The first light of morning was thin and pale, barely touching the edges of the snow. I was about to leave the bus shelter when I noticed someone approaching from the far side of the parking lot. He moved slowly, his boots crunching on the icy pavement, shoulders hunched under a faded army jacket. He saw me but didn't change his pace. When he stepped into the shelter, the smell of cold air and cigarette smoke came with him. His beard was streaked with gray, and deep lines framed his eyes. He didn't look surprised to find me there. "Cold night," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. I nodded. My voice felt stuck somewhere in my throat. He lowered himself onto the opposite end of the bench, setting down a plastic grocery bag that looked like it had been used a dozen times. From inside, he pulled out a piece of bread, dry and slightly torn at the edges, and broke it in half. He held one piece out to me. I hesitated. He must have seen it because he said, "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." The bread was hard, but I took it anyway. Hunger outweighed pride. I murmured a thank you, and he gave a small nod, like that was all he needed. "My name's Bill," he said after a moment, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Been around this part of town for longer than I care to count." I told him my name. He didn't ask why I was there, and I didn't offer an explanation. Maybe he knew it didn't matter as much as it seemed. We sat in silence for a while, chewing slowly. The snow on the street outside had started to turn slushy where the early traffic passed, leaving dark streaks on the white. Bill spoke again, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the shelter. "You know what the worst part is? It's not the cold, not the hunger. It's when people look right through you, like you're not even there. Like you stopped existing the moment you ended up here." The words hit me harder than I expected. I thought about the drivers who passed without slowing down, the way people walking by kept their gaze straight ahead. Even my stepmother's eyes that morning, how they had skimmed over me like I was just another piece of furniture she no longer wanted. I realized I had been trying to hold on to something these past few days, some sense of who I was, but it was slipping. Without a home, a job, or someone waiting for me, I was starting to feel like a shadow, easy to miss in the corner of someone else's vision. Bill leaned back, resting against the glass. "The trick," he said, "is to remember, you're still you, even if no one else sees it. You hang on to that, or this life will eat you up." We didn't talk much after that. There wasn't anything more to say, but those words stayed with me, settling into a place I didn't know had been empty. When the sun climbed higher, the streets grew busier. The shelter felt smaller with each passing minute, more exposed. Bill gathered his bag, gave me a small wave, and walked off toward a row of dumpsters behind the grocery store. I watched him go, wondering how long he'd been surviving like this, and how he managed to still have something to give. I looked down at the crumbs left in my hand and brushed them away. The bread hadn't filled me, but it had been something, like his words. The air outside was sharper now, carrying the sounds of the day starting. Car doors slamming, an engine coughing to life, the distant bark of a dog. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. If I did, I might start blending into the scenery the way Bill had warned about. I slung my bag over my shoulder, stepped out from the shelter, and turned away from the parking lot. My legs still ached from the day before, but this time I walked with a purpose I hadn't felt in days. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew it had to be somewhere else. Somewhere I could still feel like a person. The edge of town gave way to open roads sooner than I expected. The small storefronts and gas stations thinned out until all that stretched ahead was a two-lane highway cutting through white fields. Snowbanks rose high on either side, pushed there by plows in the early morning. The sky was a pale gray, the kind that promised more snow before nightfall. Each step felt louder out here. My boots crunched over the icy shoulder of the road, the sound echoing faintly in the emptiness. In the distance, I could hear the occasional hum of a car long before I saw it, the sound swelling and fading as it passed. There weren't many vehicles this far out, just a delivery truck here, a lone sedan there. Most of the time, it was only me, the road, and the wind. The wind had a way of finding every gap in my clothing. It slid down the back of my neck, pressed cold fingers against my ribs. I pulled my hat lower and kept my eyes on the stretch of highway ahead. My cheeks were raw, and my lips felt cracked. The fields on either side of the road were buried under snow so smooth it looked like a frozen ocean, wave after wave of white rolling toward the horizon. In the distance, a line of bare trees stood like sentinels, their branches dark against the pale sky. I thought about Bill's words as I walked, about not letting myself disappear. It was harder than it sounded. Out here, With nothing but snow and road signs for miles, I already felt smaller, like the landscape could swallow me without even noticing. After a while, my shoulders began to ache from carrying my bag. I shifted the strap from one side to the other, trying to keep my balance on the icy ground. My breath came out in steady clouds, each one swept away by the wind almost as soon as it left my mouth. It was then that I heard it, the deep, steady growl of an engine, louder than any I'd heard that morning. I turned my head and saw a pair of headlights in the distance, cutting through the haze. They seemed brighter than they should have been, like they were fixed directly on me. As the vehicle drew closer, the beams spread across the snow, illuminating the road ahead in stark contrast. I moved a little farther off the shoulder, not wanting to be too close when it passed. The last thing I needed was a driver losing control on the ice. The sound grew until it was all I could hear, drowning out the wind. My heart picked up, a dull thud in my ears. The truck, or whatever it was, slowed slightly as it approached. That was unusual. Out here, people usually kept their speed, eager to get wherever they were going. The vehicle came into view, a dark pickup, its paint dulled by road salt. It rolled past me at first, but then the brake lights flared red against the white snow. My steps faltered. The truck came to a stop just ahead, exhaust curling into the cold air. Every nerve in me was on alert. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, a stopped vehicle could mean help or trouble. I tightened my grip on my bag strap, my eyes fixed on the driver's side window as it began to roll down. A man's voice called out over the rumble of the engine. "You all right out here?" The tone wasn't sharp, but my guard stayed up. Out here, you learn not to trust the first thing you hear. The wind carried his words away almost as soon as he spoke them, but they lingered in my mind. I stood there for a beat too long, the snow crunching under my shifting weight. The warmth of the shelter I'd left behind that morning was a distant memory now, replaced by the reality of this moment. A stranger on an empty road, asking a question I wasn't sure how to answer. The man in the pickup leaned toward the open window, one hand resting on the steering wheel. His face was partly shadowed by the brim of a worn baseball cap, but I could see lines etched deep around his eyes, the kind that come from years of sun, wind, and maybe worry. "You okay?" he asked again, his voice steady, not rushed. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, unsure how much to say. "I'm fine," I answered, though the stiffness in my fingers and the ache in my legs told a different story. He glanced at the road ahead, then back at me. "There's a diner about 2 miles up. They've got hot coffee and a place to sit. I can give you a ride if you want." Every instinct told me to be careful. I'd heard enough stories to know not to trust a stranger just because they seemed polite. But the wind sliced across the highway again, sharp enough to make my eyes water, and the thought of something warm, anything warm, was enough to make my hesitation falter. Still, I asked, "Why stop for me?" He seemed to think about it before answering. "Because I've been where you are. Sort of. And I know a hot meal can make a difference." I studied his face for a moment. There was no pushiness in his expression, just a quiet patience. Finally, I gave a small nod. "All right." I climbed into the passenger seat, pulling the door shut behind me. The blast of warm air from the heater was almost overwhelming after hours in the cold. My shoulders loosened without my permission, and I held my hands near the vent until the sting of thawing skin set in. The truck smelled faintly of leather and pine-scented air freshener. On the dashboard sat a small battered thermos and a map folded into neat squares. The man kept his eyes on the road as we pulled away, the tires crunching over the packed snow. "I'm Michael," he said after a while. "Michael Turner." "Allison," I replied quietly. We drove mostly in silence until the neon sign of the diner came into view, buzzing faintly against the dull winter sky. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, bacon, and something sweet, maybe cinnamon rolls fresh from the oven. A waitress with tired eyes and a kind smile showed us to a booth near the window. Michael ordered coffee for himself and tea for me without asking, like he'd guessed I might need something softer. When the mugs arrived, I wrapped my hands around mine, letting the heat sink in. For a few minutes, we just sat there, the clink of dishes and the low murmur of other customers filling the space between us. Then Michael spoke, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his cup. "My wife used to love this place," he said. "We'd stop here on our way to the cabin every winter. She'd always order the blueberry pancakes, even if it was evening." There was a heaviness to the way he spoke, like each word had to be carried farther than it should. I didn't ask what happened. People don't mention someone in the past tense unless there's a reason. "She was taken from me in a snowstorm a few years back," he continued, almost like he'd read my mind. "We were hiking, and the weather turned fast. I made it out. She didn't." The silence after that was different. Not awkward, but full. I thought of my father, of how quickly he was gone, and how nothing after felt the same. I didn't tell Michael that right then, but I think he saw it in my face. The waitress brought our food: soup for me, eggs, and toast for him. I didn't realize how hungry I was until the first spoonful hit my stomach. The warmth spread outward, and for the first time in days, I felt something close to relief. When we finished, Michael leaned back in the booth, studying me with that same patient expression from the side of the road. "If you don't have anywhere to go tonight," he said, "I can take you somewhere safe, just for now." I set my spoon down slowly, my pulse quickening. It wasn't an offer I'd expected, and I didn't know yet if I'd accept. But in the quiet hum of that diner, with the snow piling up outside, the idea didn't sound as impossible as it would have an hour ago. I thought our time together would end when the check came. Michael had paid for both meals without comment, and I assumed he'd drive me back to the highway or maybe drop me somewhere in town. I was already rehearsing how to thank him without sounding desperate. Instead, he didn't reach for his coat right away. He sat back in the booth, hands wrapped around his coffee cup, eyes studying me in that steady way of his. "So, Allison," he began, his tone almost casual, "what's your plan for tonight?" The question hit harder than I expected. I hesitated, tracing the rim of my mug with one finger. "I don't have one," I admitted. "I was just going to keep walking until I figured something out." His brow furrowed slightly, like the thought didn't sit right with him. "I have a place up in the foothills," he said slowly. "It's quiet, out of the way. I run a small business from home, and I've been needing help with some paperwork, scheduling, that sort of thing. I could offer you a room there if you're willing to work." For a moment, I just stared at him. It was too much too soon, and my first reaction was suspicion. "You don't even know me," I said. "That's true," he replied, unbothered. "But I know enough to see you're out here in the cold with no real backup. I've been in my own kind of cold before. I don't want to see someone else stuck there if I can help it." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "I'm not looking for charity." "This wouldn't be charity," he said. "It's a job. You'd be working for your keep. Answering calls, sorting invoices, maybe helping me keep the place in shape. Nothing you can't handle." Part of me wanted to walk away from the offer on principle. I'd been burned enough times to know that help usually came with strings. But another part, quieter, more tired, couldn't ignore the thought of four walls and heat. "What's the catch?" I asked. Michael shook his head. "No catch. You stay as long as you want. If you decide to go, you go. I'm not in the business of keeping people where they don't want to be." I studied his face, looking for some sign of insincerity, but all I saw was patience. Maybe even a trace of understanding I couldn't quite place. "I'll do it," I said finally, "but on one condition. Pay me for the work. Enough that I can save up and move on when I'm ready." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Fair enough. He reached across the table, not for a handshake, but to slide the check toward himself again, as if to signal the deal was done. The waitress passed by, refilling his coffee. Outside, the snow had started falling again in slow, heavy flakes that clung to the diner windows. I felt a shift in my chest. Small, almost imperceptible. But it was there. For the first time in days, there was something ahead of me besides another empty stretch of road. Michael glanced toward the window. If we're going to make it up the mountain before dark, we should get going. I nodded, still unsure what I was stepping into, but knowing it had to be better than another night on a metal bench. I gathered my bag, feeling the weight of it differently now, less like a burden and more like a reminder that I still had a few things worth carrying. As we stepped out into the cold, he held the door long enough for me to pass through. The wind hit my face, sharp and familiar. But this time I followed someone else to the truck instead of facing it alone. The pickup rumbled to life, its engine growling against the cold. As we pulled out of the diner's parking lot, the world outside seemed quieter, the snowfall softening every edge. Streetlights gave way to open stretches of road lined with bare trees. The further we drove, the more the houses thinned out, replaced by long shadows and the endless white of winter. Michael kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting lightly near the gear shift. He didn't speak much, and I didn't push. Every so often, the light from the dashboard would catch his profile. A strong jaw, eyes fixed ahead, a crease in his brow that seemed permanent. He drove like a man who knew every curve of the road, but never stopped scanning for what might come next. The heater hummed low, filling the cab with a warmth I hadn't felt in days. I loosened my scarf but kept my coat zipped. Old habits die hard, especially the ones that come from being cold too long. My fingers curled loosely in my lap, and I found myself stealing glances at him. He seemed closed off, not in an unkind way, but as if his thoughts were somewhere far beyond the reach of casual conversation. I wondered if he'd been like this his whole life, or if the loss he'd mentioned at the diner had built those walls. People change when they lose someone. Sometimes they harden, not to keep others out, but to keep themselves from breaking again. The road began to climb, winding through stretches of pine forest. Snow clung to the branches, bending them slightly under its weight. Every turn revealed a new view, steep drop-offs where the valley spread wide below, frozen streams cutting through the trees, and clusters of evergreens standing like quiet sentries in the fading light. Beautiful up here in the winter, Michael said at one point, almost to himself. I nodded. It's quiet. That's the point, he replied, a faint smile touching his voice, though his eyes never left the road. We passed a small gas station, the only sign of life for miles, then turned onto a narrower road where the snow was packed down in 2 tire tracks. I imagined this place in the summer, green and alive, but now it felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath. Michael drove carefully, slowing around sharp bends where the edge of the road dropped into nothing but white haze. The higher we climbed, the heavier the snow seemed to fall, catching in the beams of the headlights like silver dust. I pressed my forehead lightly against the cool glass of the passenger window, watching the world slip by. Part of me felt uneasy, not about him exactly, but about the fact that I was heading deeper into an unfamiliar place with someone I'd only met a few hours ago. Yet, there was something about the way he kept his focus on the road, never rushing, that made me think he wasn't a man who acted on impulse. After what felt like half an hour, he slowed the truck and turned onto a long driveway flanked by tall pines. The tires crunched over fresh snow, the sound muffled by the dense forest. Then, through the trees, I saw it. A house built of weathered timber, its roof heavy with snow, warm light glowing in a few windows. It wasn't large, but it had a presence. the kind of place that looked like it belonged to the land rather than sitting on it. Smoke drifted from a stone chimney, curling into the cold evening air. Michael parked near a stack of split firewood, the engine settling into silence. For a moment, we both sat there, the glow from the house spilling across the snow between us and the door. "Welcome," he said simply, his voice quiet in the stillness. I opened the door, stepping into the sharp air. The snow crunched under my boots, and I followed him toward the front steps. My eyes lingered on the golden light spilling from inside, and for the first time in days, I felt the pull of somewhere that might be more than just shelter. The warmth hit me the moment Michael opened the front door. It wasn't just from the heat. It was the kind of warmth that came from a space that had been lived in for years. The scent of burning wood drifted from the fireplace in the living room, where flames moved lazily behind the glass door. The entryway opened into a wide space with a worn leather couch, bookshelves lined with paperbacks, and a heavy wooden table scarred with knife marks and coffee rings. The place didn't look staged or polished. It looked real, like every object had a purpose and a history. Michael set my bag down near the stairs and gestured for me to follow. He showed me the kitchen, where a kettle sat on the stove, and the pantry, stocked with canned goods, pasta, and jars of coffee. Then he led me upstairs to a small room at the end of the hall. "This'll be yours," he said, stepping aside so I could enter. The room held a simple bed with a thick quilt, a dresser, and a small desk by the window. The glass was fogged from the difference in temperature, but beyond it, I could see the tops of snow-covered pines swaying slightly in the wind. "It's not much," he added. "It's enough," I said, and I meant it. I set my bag on the bed while he gave me a quick rundown of the work he had in mind: organizing files, answering emails for his business, keeping track of invoices. "The office is downstairs, across from the kitchen," he said. "We'll start tomorrow morning." But the next day came faster than I expected. The sun rose pale and cold over the mountains, and by the time I came down for coffee, Michael was already at the heavy desk in the office, sorting through a stack of papers. He pointed me toward a laptop on the smaller desk in the corner. "Email passwords are in the top drawer, the filing cabinet's by your side. If you have questions, just ask." The work was straightforward, nothing I hadn't done before in temp jobs, but there was a rhythm to it that I liked. Sorting contracts into labeled folders, flagging urgent messages, entering payment dates into a spreadsheet. It kept my hands busy and my mind from drifting too far into places I didn't want to go. Michael, on the other hand, worked in near silence. He spoke when he needed to, never more than a few sentences at a time, and there were stretches when the only sounds were the scratch of his pen and the faint hum of the heater. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it made me wonder what went on in the spaces between his words. Every so often, I caught him pausing over an old folder, staring at it for a few seconds before tucking it away. His eyes would soften in those moments, then close back up like shutters. I didn't ask. We were still strangers in many ways, and prying felt like breaking something fragile. By midday, I'd cleared the backlog of unread emails and stacked a neat pile of sorted papers on the corner of his desk. He glanced at it, gave a brief nod of approval, then returned to whatever invoice he was reviewing. The rest of the day passed in that quiet rhythm, tasks handed over without fuss, completed without ceremony. When the sun dipped low behind the trees, Michael stood, stretching his shoulders. "Good work today," he said simply. "Dinner's at 7 if you want to join." I nodded, shutting down the laptop. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I realized I hadn't thought about the road, or the bus shelter, or the endless walking for hours. The quiet here was different from the quiet out there. This quiet didn't erase me. It gave me space. A few days into the job, I was sent to clear out a storage cabinet in the back of the office. The drawers were stiff, the metal cold to the touch. Inside, there were stacks of receipts, outdated brochures, and envelopes with curling edges. I worked methodically, tossing what was clearly useless, setting aside anything that looked important. Near the bottom of the last drawer, I found a small bundle of postcards held together with a rubber band gone brittle with age. The one on top stopped me. It was a photograph of a snow-covered mountain ridge under a sky streaked with pink light. Sunrise? Maybe sunset. In the bottom corner, printed in delicate script, it read, "Winter's Crown, Colorado." The image pulled at something in me. It looked like the kind of place you'd hike to with someone you trusted. The air sharp and clean, the silence almost sacred. I turned it over. There was no message, just a date from 10 years ago and a short note. For when we go back. I loosened the band and looked through the rest. Most were scenes of mountains, forests, or lakes, quiet places, untouched by crowds. I couldn't help but wonder who had picked them out, and why they'd never been mailed. When I finished clearing the drawer, I left the postcards on top of the stack of sorted papers and carried them to Michael's desk. He was in the kitchen, so I placed the top one, the one with the pink sky, just to the side of his keyboard, where he'd be sure to see it. Later, when I returned to the office, he was sitting at the desk, holding the card. His eyes were fixed on it in a way that told me it was more than just a pretty picture to him. "Found that in the back cabinet," I said, breaking the quiet. "Figured you might want it out where you can see it." He set it down gently, as if it might break. "I bought this on a trip with my wife," he said, his voice low. "We meant to go back to that ridge the next year. Never did." I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I didn't want to push him into a place he wasn't ready to go. He looked at me then, and for a moment the guarded expression I'd grown used to wasn't there. "You know," he said, "this place has felt colder than it should for a long time, but since you've been here, it's different." I frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. "Different how?" Michael gave a small shrug, like he didn't want to overstate it. "You make it less cold." The words hung between us, simple but heavy. I wasn't sure if he was talking about the house or the work, or something else entirely. Either way, I felt the truth of them settle into me. I didn't have an answer that felt right, so I just nodded and returned to my desk. But for the rest of the day, my eyes kept drifting to that postcard on the corner of his workspace. That night, as I lay in bed under the thick quilt, I found myself thinking about his words. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was something quieter, more meaningful. And I realized it had been a long time since anyone had said something that made me feel like I was changing the space I was in, instead of just taking up room. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the clouds sat low over the mountains and the light through the windows was the color of pewter. I was halfway through organizing invoices when the office phone rang. Michael was in the kitchen, pouring himself another cup of coffee, so I reached for the receiver. The voice on the other end was brisk, professional. "This is Dana from Clearwater Investments. Is Mr. Turner available? We're expecting him for the Aspen meeting this afternoon, but the itinerary says he hasn't confirmed." I glanced toward the doorway. "One moment," I said, covering the mouthpiece. "Michael, it's Dana from Clearwater. Something about a meeting in Aspen today." He stepped into the room, coffee in hand, his expression unreadable. "Tell her I won't be attending," he said, his tone flat. I hesitated. "Do you want to reschedule?" "No," he cut in, setting the mug down on the edge of his desk. "Just tell her something came up." I relayed the message, hearing the pause on the other end before Dana responded with a clipped, "All right." "Thank you." When I hung up, the air in the room felt heavier. I turned in my chair to face him. "Wasn't that important?" Michael shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "It's not something I want to deal with right now." "But you were supposed to be there," I pressed, more curious than accusatory. We didn't get much outside contact in this place. Calls like that stood out. He picked up a folder and flipped it open, clearly signaling the conversation was over. There are things in life you learn to walk away from, he said, almost to himself. The words should have closed the subject, but they didn't. The rest of the morning, I caught myself glancing at him, wondering why someone would turn down what sounded like a high-profile meeting. It wasn't that I thought he owed me an explanation. We were still more employer and employee than anything else. But since the day I arrived, I'd been piecing together little details about him, the way his eyes lingered on old photographs, the quiet rituals he kept, and this felt like a missing piece I didn't know how to place. By lunchtime, the silence between us had a different texture. It wasn't the comfortable quiet we'd grown used to. It was more guarded, as if both of us were holding something back. I made sandwiches and left his on the corner of his desk without a word. He murmured a thank you, eyes still on the papers in front of him. That afternoon, the snow started falling again. Big wet flakes that clung to the glass. I worked through my usual tasks, but the unanswered question kept looping in my mind. Why turn away from something that seemed to matter? Once or twice I caught him staring out the window, his hands still on the desk, the coffee beside him going cold. There was a restlessness in the set of his shoulders, like he wanted to be somewhere else and nowhere at the same time. By the time I shut down my laptop for the day, the distance between us felt more pronounced. Not a fight, not even a disagreement. Just a small hairline crack in the quiet understanding we'd built. I told myself it was none of my business, but as I climbed the stairs to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the kind of thing that, if left unspoken, might start to grow. That evening, the smell of roasted chicken drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the faint scent of pine from the wood stacked near the stove. We ate most nights in a quiet rhythm, 2 plates, a few simple dishes, conversation limited to practical matters. But tonight, the silence felt heavier, almost deliberate. I set the plates on the table while Michael poured water into our glasses. His eyes were shadowed in the low light, the lines in his face deeper somehow. For a while, we ate without speaking, the only sounds the scrape of utensils against the plates and the occasional crack from the fire. Halfway through the meal, he set down his fork and leaned back slightly. "About earlier," he began, his voice slower than usual. "The call you took?" I looked up, waiting. "I wasn't ready to deal with Aspen," he said, staring at his glass. "That's where she died." The words landed like a weight between us. He didn't have to say her name. I knew he meant his wife. "It was 3 years ago, early spring," he went on. "The snow was melting in town, but higher up it was still deep. We'd gone hiking, a trail we'd taken dozens of times before. The forecast said clear skies." His gaze drifted somewhere past me, into a place only he could see. "The weather turned fast. You hear that a lot in the mountains, but it's different when you're in it. One minute we were laughing about which way to go, the next we could barely see each other through the white. I told her to stay close. I turned around." He stopped, pressing his lips together. The fire popped in the silence. When I looked back, she was gone. I searched until I couldn't feel my hands, shouting her name until my voice was gone. They found her 2 days later. He didn't cry. His voice didn't break. But there was something in his tone, a controlled ache, the kind you keep in a locked drawer but still carry every day. "I stopped going to Aspen after that," he said. "Stopped a lot of things." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I told him about my father. "It was sudden," I said, pushing my food around the plate. "A heart attack in his sleep. No warning, no chance to say anything. I came home from work and the house was quiet. Too quiet." I told him how the months after felt like walking through fog, how my stepmother grew more distant until one day she decided I didn't belong there anymore. I kept thinking if Dad were still alive, he wouldn't have let that happen, I said. But I'll never know. Michael's eyes met mine then, steady and searching. Losing them changes the way you move through the world, he said. You start measuring time by before and after. I nodded. And sometimes it feels like the after never really ends. The rest of the meal passed in a quieter kind of silence, not empty, but shared. When we finished, Michael cleared the plates without asking, and I stayed, at the table, watching the fire burn low. For the first time since arriving, I felt like we'd stepped into the same room emotionally, not just physically. We were two people who had lost someone irreplaceable, both learning, slowly, awkwardly, how to exist in the after. By late March, the snow began to loosen its grip on the mountain. The edges of the driveway showed patches of brown earth, and the icicles that had hung from the eaves for months now dripped steadily, their water tracing thin lines down the siding. The air still held a chill, but there was a softness to it, as if the whole place was taking a slow, careful breath after the long freeze. Inside, my days settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Work in the office through the morning, chores around the house in the afternoon, evenings by the fire. Somewhere in the quiet, an idea had taken root. I started sorting through the boxes of photographs I'd brought with me, most of them old snapshots my father had kept in a shoebox. Faded images of my mother, smiling in front of rivers and mountain trails, her hair caught in the wind. I scanned them, paired them with my own pictures of the peaks and valleys I'd explored on my better days. What began as a way to fill the slower hours turned into something larger, a photo book, part memoir, part tribute. I wrote small passages to go alongside each image, stories my father had told me about my mother, and my own reflections on the places in the photos. It was clumsy at first, but the more I worked, the more it felt like stitching together two halves of a story that had always been mine to tell. Michael never asked what I was working on, though he noticed the growing stack of printed pages on my desk. He would pass by, glance at them, and keep walking. Part of me was grateful for the space. By mid-April, the snow in the yard was gone, except for a few stubborn piles in the shade of the pines. I printed the final pages one afternoon and set them in order, binding them loosely with twine. It wasn't polished. It was just something for me, a way to keep my parents close in a form I could hold. I left the bundle on the corner of my desk and went outside to stack firewood for the still cool nights. When I came back in, it was gone. I found Michael in the living room, the pages spread carefully across the coffee table. He was reading slowly, tracing each photo with his eyes before moving on to the next. "This is good," he said when he noticed me. "It's just personal," I replied, suddenly self-conscious. I wasn't planning to show anyone. He didn't press, just gathered the pages neatly and handed them back. "You might want to think about sharing it." I laughed a little, shaking my head. "It's not ready for that." He didn't argue, and I thought that was the end of it. 2 weeks later, I found out I was wrong. I was in the office answering emails when the phone rang. The woman on the line introduced herself as an editor from a small publishing house in Boulder. She said she'd received a submission from a Michael Turner, a photo memoir titled Winter's Crown. She wanted to talk about the possibility of turning it into a book. I stared at the wall, my mind catching up to her words. "You have my work?" "Yes," she said warmly. "It's beautiful, honest. I'd love to hear more about your vision for it." When I hung up, Michael was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame. He didn't look apologetic exactly, but there was a hint of caution in his eyes. "You sent it?" I asked. "I did," he said simply, "because it deserves to be seen." I didn't know whether to thank him or be angry at the intrusion. But beneath the surprise, Something else stirred, an unfamiliar mix of hope and fear. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, buried among invoices and supply orders. I almost missed it. The subject line read, "Acceptance. Winter's Crown." For a moment, I just stared at the words, my cursor hovering over them. My stomach felt tight, the way it does before you open a door without knowing what's on the other side. When I finally clicked, the message spilled across the screen in neat paragraphs. They loved the manuscript. They wanted to publish it. Photographs, stories, everything. The editor wrote about how the work captured both the beauty of the mountains and the fragility of the people who move through them. She said it felt personal yet universal, and that she believed readers would carry it with them long after they closed the book. I read it twice, then a third time, just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. My hands were trembling, and I had to sit back in my chair before I dropped the laptop. Michael appeared in the doorway, holding his coffee mug. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. I turned the screen toward him. "They're going to publish it." His eyes moved quickly over the email, and a small smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "I told you it deserved to be seen." I laughed once, shakily. I didn't think anyone would care. I didn't even think it was real enough. "It's real," he said, his tone firm. "And now the rest of the world gets to see it too." The warmth in his voice caught me off guard. For weeks, we'd lived in this quiet balance, our conversations measured and careful. But now there was something different, lighter, in the space between us. I looked back at the screen, my chest tight in a way that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. "It feels strange," I admitted, like someone turned a light on and I didn't realize how dark it had been. Michael set his mug down on my desk and met my gaze. "You're not invisible anymore, Allison." The words hit deeper than I expected. I thought of Bill at the bus shelter, his warning about how easy it was to disappear, to blend into the background until no one saw you. Back then, I'd been so close to that edge I could feel the drop beneath my feet. And now, somehow, I was standing in the open again. I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch. But it wasn't the old kind of silence, the one that pressed down like weight. This was lighter, warmer. The rest of the day passed differently. The office didn't feel as still. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed part of something alive. Michael worked at his desk with a faint hum under his breath, and I caught myself smiling more than once without realizing it. That evening, we ate dinner at the heavy wooden table, the fire casting gold light across the walls. We didn't talk much about the book, but it was there in every glance, in the way Michael passed the bread without looking, trusting I'd take it. Later, as I stood by the window in my room, I looked out at the trees swaying under the early spring wind. The night felt less cold than it had in months. For the first time since I'd left Denver, the idea of a future didn't feel impossible. It felt like it was already on its way. Winter had come back to the mountain, but it felt different this time. The wind still carried the bite of ice, the snow still softened the edges of the pines, but it wasn't the kind of cold that seeped into my bones anymore. It was the kind that wrapped the world in quiet, like a pause you didn't want to end. Michael and I stood on the front porch, our boots sinking slightly into the thin layer of fresh snow. The air smelled of wood smoke from the fire we'd left burning inside. Out beyond the yard, the forest was still, each branch heavy with white. "It's been a year," Michael said, his breath hanging in the air. I glanced at him, remembering the first time I saw this house through the trees. Back then, it had been a refuge, a stopgap between what I'd lost and whatever came next. I didn't know then that next would turn into something steady. "You've changed the place," he added. I smiled faintly. "I think the place changed me." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. It was smooth, the grain darkened and polished, the lid carved with a pattern of pine needles. He held it out. "What's this?" I asked. "Open it." Inside, resting on a square of deep green felt, was a key. It was simple, silver, but along the bow, just above the notches, were the engraved words, "Home." For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the branches. My fingers closed around the cool metal, the weight of it both ordinary and immense. I started, then stopped. "Are you sure?" Michael nodded. "You've been here a year. You've worked hard, kept the place running, kept me sane. I think it's time you knew this isn't just a place you're staying. It's your home too. As long as you want it." Something tightened in my chest, the way it had the day the publisher's email came. Only this was heavier, rooted deeper. I thought of the bus shelter, the endless road, the way I'd felt like I was fading. I thought of Bill's warning, that the worst part was feeling invisible. And now, standing here with the key in my hand, I realized I hadn't felt invisible in a long time. I looked at him, the snow catching in his hair, the lines around his eyes softened by the light from the window behind us. "Thank you," I said, and it didn't feel like enough. "You've earned it," he replied simply. We stood there for a while longer, watching the snow fall. Inside, the firelight flickered against the walls, casting a warm glow through the front windows. When we finally went in, I set the box on the mantel, where I could see it from the couch. The key wasn't just for the door, it was for everything the last year had built. Trust, steadiness, the quiet knowledge that I belonged somewhere again. For the first time since my father died, I knew where home was. And it was here, on this mountain, in a house where the winter no longer felt like something to survive, but something to share. The snow had been falling since before dawn, laying a fresh blanket over the driveway and the road that wound down toward town. From the porch, I could see the forest fading into white, the horizon blurred as if the world had decided to soften its own edges. I leaned against the railing, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, the steam curling into the cold air. Something about the way the snow fell that morning pulled me backward in time, back to a year ago, walking along a frozen highway with no plan and no one waiting for me. My boots had been soaked through, my fingers stiff, and the wind had cut through every layer I owned. I remember thinking that winter might be the thing that finally broke me. Now winter felt different. The cold was still there, but it didn't seep in the same way. It stayed outside, where it belonged, while the warmth lived here, in the walls, in the firelight, in the quiet understanding between Michael and me. Sometimes I still pictured that first night in the bus shelter, the sound of cars passing, the feeling of being so small the world could forget me. But when I thought of it now, it was like looking at a photograph of someone I used to know. She was me, but she wasn't. Behind me, the door opened and Michael stepped onto the porch. He handed me a scarf I hadn't realized I'd left on the back of the chair. "It's colder than it looks," he said. I smiled, wrapping it around my neck. I remember when colder than it looks was the least of my problems. We stood together, watching the snow drift down through the pines. There was no rush, no sense of needing to be anywhere else. "You ever think about how you ended up here?" he asked. "All the time," I said. "If you hadn't stopped that day..." I trailed off, not sure how to finish. "Maybe it wasn't just me stopping," he said after a moment. "Maybe you were meant to be here." I didn't know if I believed in fate exactly, but I knew what it felt like to look back and see a straight line where, at the time, there had only been chaos. Every wrong turn, every closed door, every mile of frozen road had led me here, to a house on a mountain, to work that gave me purpose, to a man who had lost as much as I had but still made room for someone else in his life. I took a long breath, the air sharp in my lungs, and felt an unexpected swell of gratitude. Not just for Michael, but for the road itself, for the way it had forced me forward when I thought I couldn't take another step. The snow kept falling, soft and steady, as if it had nowhere else to be. "Come on," Michael said finally, "before the coffee gets cold." We went back inside, the door closing behind us with a solid click, shutting out the wind. The fire was still burning, and the light from it reached into every corner of the room. I set my mug down on the table and glanced once more at the key box on the mantel. Winter hadn't changed, but I had. And because of that, it no longer scared me.